who played God on the big screen. Now he's praying to Jesus on live TV. What began as a routine interview between Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman spiraled into something no one expected. Raw emotion, a life-changing confession, and a moment so powerful it stunned millions into silence. But what did Keanu say that brought Morgan Freeman to tears? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the Manhattan skyline when Keanu Reeves stepped out of the black SUV and quietly entered the CBS studio through the side entrance. He didn't bring an entourage, no assistant, no press manager trailing behind him. Just a simple canvas jacket over a black t-shirt, a journal tucked under one arm, and a tiny wooden cross looped into a leather cord around his neck. There were no flashing lights, no shouting fans. He preferred it that way. Today's appearance wasn't about promoting a blockbuster film or accepting another award. It was something quieter but strangely heavier. The network had arranged a live segment on Sunday morning, a conversation between Keanu and Morgan Freeman. The official purpose was to discuss Keanu's voiceover work in an upcoming documentary titled Endurance, a moving project about spiritual resilience through suffering. The documentary had already made waves in film circles for its raw depiction of human pain and healing, featuring real stories of trauma survivors from around the world. But producers knew the true hook wasn't the film itself. It was the pairing of two of Hollywood's most enigmatic voices, Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman, sitting face-to-face, live. Morgan Freeman had agreed to host the segment. Known globally for his dignified presence and that unmistakable voice, he was also known for asking real, unfiltered questions. Unlike most celebrity interviews, Morgan didn't play nice to stay polite. He dug, and when faith came up, he wasn't afraid to challenge or push back. Everyone in the control room knew it. So did Keanu. Keanu made his way to the dressing room, prepared for him on the second floor. A simple sign on the door read, "Reeves." Inside, he closed the door softly, placed the journal on the vanity, and sat on the small couch in the corner. The room was clean and quiet. A single water bottle sat untouched on the table. He took the wooden cross from around his neck and laid it flat in his palm. Then, without a word, he closed his eyes and bowed his head. For nearly 15 minutes he sat still, not rehearsing lines, not thinking about his public image, just praying. He prayed for clarity, for humility, for strength not to defend his faith, but to represent it with grace. He didn't know how the interview would unfold, but he knew what he wouldn't do. He wouldn't hide the truth. Not this time. The journal in front of him held pages of handwritten reflections, some from last week, others from years ago, quotes from scripture, lyrics, private prayers he'd never spoken aloud. He flipped it open and ran a hand slowly down the margin. A line he had scribbled just a few nights before caught his eye. Truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands there, waiting to be seen. He felt the weight of the moment settling in. The interview would be live, unrehearsed, raw. Morgan Freeman was known to challenge traditional religious answers, and Keanu, while spiritual in private, had never been outspoken about Jesus Christ on television, not once. But something in him had changed, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to let the world see what had been shaping him in silence for years. Meanwhile, just one floor above, the studio team was preparing for the live broadcast. Lights were being adjusted, microphones were checked twice. The technical director gave updates through her headset, her voice calm but clipped. Everything had to run perfectly. This wasn't just a taped segment. It was national television, live and unscripted. In the main studio, the chairs had already been arranged. A sleek, minimal set design with two armchairs facing one another across a low table. Between them sat two mugs and a single camera set dead center. The scene was designed to feel intimate, less like an interview, more like a conversation between two old friends. But there was an unspoken tension in the air. Producers knew what this meeting could become. Morgan Freeman was legendary not just for his narration work and acting career, but for his long-standing philosophical view of faith. He had narrated documentaries about religion. He had questioned the legitimacy of organized belief. He had often said in interviews that he believed in something greater, but didn't subscribe to any personal God. So when he asked questions about faith, it wasn't from a place of hostility, but it wasn't passive curiosity either. And Keanu? He was Hollywood's mystery, the man who quietly gave away millions to people in need, the man who mourned in silence, who never spoke about his tragedies on camera, the man who, despite fame and fortune, seemed most comfortable sitting on a subway bench alone. Today, that man would be asked, on live television, what he really believed. Downstairs, the stage manager knocked once before entering Keanu's room. 10 minutes, Mr. Reeves, she said softly. He nodded, rising slowly from the couch. He put the cross back around his neck and closed the journal. Slipping it into his coat pocket, he gave her a polite smile and followed her out. As he walked toward the stage, he passed Morgan's dressing room. The door was slightly ajar. Keanu paused for just a second. Inside, Morgan was reviewing his notes. His reading glasses perched on his nose. He was focused, professional. He looked up just as Keanu glanced in. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no tension, just something quietly mutual, a shared recognition that today might become more than either of them had planned. "We're ready for this?" Morgan asked, his voice casual, but there was something deeper behind the words. Keanu gave a small nod. "Let's see where it takes us." No more was said. Back on set, the countdown had begun. Final checks were confirmed, cameras locked in. The floor director raised her hand for silence. Morgan took his seat. Keanu sat across from him, posture relaxed, but heart steady. The red light blinked to life. The interview had begun. But no one, not the producers, not the audience, not even the men sitting across from each other, had any idea how far it would go. The camera panned gently as Morgan welcomed viewers to the program. His tone was calm, steady, familiar. "Today," he said, "we have a special guest. Someone you all know, but perhaps not as deeply as you think." He turned to Keanu, who returned the greeting with a respectful nod and a warm smile. The energy between them was polite but cautious, like two men stepping into deep water, unsure of how cold it might be. Morgan opened with a few questions about the documentary. Keanu responded thoughtfully, speaking about the themes of endurance, quiet strength, and the unseen battles people fight every day. It was safe ground, the usual press circuit script. But that wasn't why the studio was silent. The crew wasn't listening for a film review. They were watching for the moment when the conversation would veer into something unexpected. When Keanu would be asked, in front of a national audience, what sustained him through the darkest seasons of his life. Everyone knew that moment was coming. The only question was how honest he'd be when it arrived. Morgan shifted slightly in his seat. "The documentary focuses a lot on suffering," he said, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "And you've known more than your share of it. Yet people say you're one of the kindest souls in this business, that you carry peace into every room. Where does that come from?" Keanu paused. The lights didn't flicker. No sound interrupted them. Just silence, and that single question hovering in the air. His voice was soft, almost hesitant at first. "It comes from pain, but also from the one who met me in it." Morgan leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean faith?" Keanu nodded once. "Yes." "Jesus." It was the first time many viewers had ever heard him say that name in public. The studio didn't gasp. The crew didn't blink. But something shifted in the room. The silence deepened. not awkward, reverent. Morgan looked at him curiously, but not skeptically. "I've always been fascinated by that name," he said. "Jesus, people either say it with fire or they don't say it at all. You say it differently. Why?" Keanu folded his hands. He didn't smile, didn't deflect. "Because I say it like someone who knows him." And just like that, the tone of the interview changed. The red light on the camera stayed on. But for everyone watching, on set and across the country, this no longer felt like television. It felt like something far more personal was beginning. The live feed had only been running for a few minutes, but something in the air already felt different. Morgan Freeman's introduction had been smooth, professional, and warm, but there was a subtle intensity beneath it. This wasn't just another celebrity chat. The audience watching from home didn't know it yet, but they would feel it soon. Sitting across from him, Keanu Reeves remained composed. His posture was relaxed but not disengaged. He answered the opening questions thoughtfully, speaking about the documentary's exploration of resilience, of people who had suffered deeply but continued on anyway. "They're not famous," Keanu said. "They're not on red carpets, but they have more strength than anyone I've ever met." Morgan nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pen once on the table. "You've always been drawn to roles that wrestle with loss, redemption, and sacrifice. From John Wick to The Matrix, those themes follow you. Why do you think that is?" Keanu looked down for a second, then met Morgan's gaze. "Because I've lived them." The response wasn't dramatic. He didn't elaborate, but those few words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Morgan paused, then leaned forward, shifting gears without warning. "Do you believe in God, Keanu?" There it was. The moment. It wasn't asked with malice or mockery, just clarity, directness. And in the control room, someone visibly tensed. On the floor, a cameraman adjusted his focus without taking his eyes off the scene. Keanu didn't blink. "Yes," he said, simply. "I do. Deeply." That was when everything began to shift. Morgan tilted his head, slightly surprised. "You say that like it's more than just an opinion. What does it mean to you to believe in God?" Keanu rested his hands on his lap. "It means I don't walk alone. It means my pain isn't meaningless. And it means there's a love that held me when I didn't think I could go on." For a moment, Morgan said nothing. He looked down at his own notes, then set them aside. He didn't need the script anymore. "Let me ask you something even harder," Morgan said gently. "What does Jesus mean to you?" Keanu took a breath. He didn't rush the answer. He didn't smile for the camera or package it in a soundbite. He just sat with it for a moment, the silence thick but peaceful. Then, with steady eyes and a steady voice, he spoke. "To me," Keanu said, "Jesus is not a symbol, not a myth, not a tradition. He's the one who met me in my grief. He's the one who never left." The studio went quiet, not because it was awkward, but because everyone was listening. Something real had just entered the room. Morgan took in Keanu's words with a kind of quiet contemplation, his fingers interlaced as he leaned back in his chair. The question he asked next came not from a script, but from somewhere personal. "Was there a moment," Morgan asked slowly, "when you stopped just believing and actually started to feel like Jesus was real?" Keanu nodded. Yes, there was. He didn't look to the camera. His focus stayed with Morgan. The audience could wait. This wasn't a performance. "It was after my daughter passed," Keanu said, his voice steady but reverent. "I had done everything people said would help. Therapy, work, distraction. But nothing reached the part of me that was bleeding. I didn't even know what to pray. I just sat in a dark room one night and whispered, 'If you're real, please help me.'" Morgan's expression softened. He didn't interrupt. "And I didn't hear a voice," Keanu continued. "I didn't see a light. But I felt this stillness, a warmth I hadn't felt in months. I knew someone was there. I knew I wasn't alone. It was small, but it was enough. The audience at home didn't need dramatic music or clever editing. They just needed to hear the truth, and in Keanu's voice, they found it. Morgan looked down for a moment, then lifted his gaze. That's not something people say lightly, especially on live TV. I know, Keanu replied. But truth doesn't wait for permission. It just is. The control room remained still. The floor crew had stopped fidgeting. Even the producer, who had expected a good segment but nothing groundbreaking, knew something deeper was unfolding. Morgan's next words came out almost reluctantly, like they had been buried under decades of performance and public image. I've played God on screen, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I've narrated stories about faith and belief, but I've never felt what you just described. I've always wondered if people were just comforting themselves with stories. Keanu's voice didn't shift into argument. He didn't defend anything. I understand, he said gently. I used to think that way too. Morgan blinked, surprised. You did? Keanu nodded. For years, I thought faith was wishful thinking, but I didn't understand. Faith isn't about ignoring pain. It's about being honest with it. Jesus didn't make my pain disappear. He stepped into it with me. For a moment, Morgan was silent. His eyes weren't challenging now. They were searching. And ever since that night, Keanu added softly, I've never felt completely alone again. Even in the silence, even when the answers didn't come, I was held. It wasn't a sermon. It was a confession. And that's what made it powerful. Morgan sat quietly, his fingers resting against his chin. His next question was softer, but it struck even deeper. Keanu, why haven't you talked about this before? Keanu looked down briefly, then lifted his eyes again. Because I didn't want to use it, he said. Faith is sacred to me. It's not part of a press tour. It's not something to market. I needed it to be real in my life before I ever spoke it out loud. Morgan nodded slowly. And today, Keanu's voice steadied. Today, I feel like someone needs to hear it. There was no spotlight moment, no applause. Just two men, one asking, one answering, and in between, something raw and unguarded was happening. Morgan leaned forward again, his tone almost fatherly now. You know, people admire you because you've lived through hell and came out kind. You've lost more than most, yet you never became bitter. You just kept giving. Quietly. Why? Keanu answered without hesitation. Because that's what he did for me. He continued. When I had nothing left, when I had every reason to shut the world out, Jesus didn't lecture me. He didn't wait for me to clean myself up. He just loved me. And when someone loves you like that, it changes how you walk through the world. The camera zoomed in slightly, not for drama, but to capture the tenderness in his expression. I don't always get it right, Keanu admitted. But I remember what it felt like to be seen in my worst moment and not turned away. That kind of grace isn't something you forget. Morgan took a long breath. Do you ever feel afraid, he asked, that sharing this might cost you something in this industry? Keanu smiled gently. I think the cost of silence is higher. A hush fell again, one deeper than the last. Across the country, viewers leaned in, not because they were being sold something, but because they were watching something real, something rare. A man who had walked through unspeakable loss was offering not answers, but presence, and somehow that was more powerful. Morgan glanced down at his papers, then set them aside again. I had a list of things to talk about today, he said. Keanu gave a faint smile. Looks like we took a different road. Morgan nodded. And maybe, he said, his voice rich with new weight, it's the one we were supposed to take all along. Morgan sat forward, elbows resting gently on his knees. eyes never leaving Keanu. The conversation had drifted far from the original topic, but no one in the room seemed eager to pull it back. The story unfolding didn't need direction. It was moving on its own. Keanu glanced down at the floor for a moment. His fingers were lightly intertwined, resting in his lap. When he spoke again, his voice was even and steady, but the ache underneath was unmistakable. "There was a time when I stopped caring about everything," he said. "People think grief comes in waves. For me, it was more like drowning in still water." Morgan didn't interrupt. "I lost my daughter before she ever took her first breath," Keanu continued. "Her name was Ava. She was stillborn, 8 months into the pregnancy." He paused. The studio was absolutely silent. Even the soft hum of equipment felt distant now. "A few weeks later," Keanu said, "her mother, Jennifer, died in a car accident." His voice didn't crack, not because he wasn't hurting, but because the wound had scarred so deeply it had reshaped him. There's this moment you have when everything you thought your life was going to be disappears. It's like watching the future collapse. I remember looking around my home, seeing the crib we never used, the letters we wrote to her during the pregnancy, the ultrasound photos still on the fridge, and feeling nothing. Morgan's eyes glistened, but he didn't move. "I kept working," Keanu went on. "I showed up on set, I smiled in interviews, but inside I was just walking through ash. Nothing had weight, nothing made sense." He looked up, finally meeting Morgan's eyes again. "I didn't want to die," Keanu said, "but I didn't want to keep living either, not like that." Morgan whispered, "What did you do?" Keanu took a breath. "All night, I found myself walking, no destination, just moving so I wouldn't collapse. I ended up outside this small chapel downtown. I didn't even know if it was open, but the door wasn't locked. The image landed softly in the minds of everyone listening. I stepped inside," he said. "It was empty, no lights, no people, just old wooden pews and the smell of candles long since burned out. I sat in the back. I didn't kneel. I didn't cross myself. I didn't know how to pray." He looked away briefly, collecting the memory. "I just said, if you're real, if you're out there, please help me." The silence that followed wasn't for dramatic effect. It was reverence. "And in that silence," Keanu said slowly, "he met me." Morgan's eyes didn't leave him. The world around them, lights, cameras, countdown clocks, had faded into the background. All that remained was the story and the man telling it, without flinching. Keanu continued, his tone softer now. "It wasn't some vision or voice, no thunder, no bright light, just presence, just stillness that felt like someone was sitting beside me." He looked down at his hands as he spoke, fingers curling slightly inward. "For the first time in months, I felt warmth in my chest. Not happiness, not comfort, just acknowledgement. Like someone had been watching my pain the whole time and was finally letting me know I wasn't invisible." Morgan's voice was low. "You believe that was Jesus?" Keanu nodded. "I don't just believe it, I know it." A quiet moment passed before Keanu added, "He didn't take the grief away. He didn't make everything okay. But he gave me something I hadn't had in months. Peace." The phrase echoed through the room. "I didn't even know it was peace until later," he continued. "It was like when you've been in a storm so long you forget what stillness feels like. And then, for one moment, the wind stops." Morgan sat back, visibly affected. "Did you keep going back?" he asked. Keanu nodded. "Every night for a week. Same pew, same chapel, still no one else there. I didn't bring prayers, I didn't recite scripture. I just sat and let him sit with me. No demands, no expectations, just presence." Morgan leaned in. "Did it change you?" Keanu looked directly at him. "Completely." He paused, then said, "I didn't become religious. I didn't suddenly have answers to life, but I had an anchor, something that held me when the waves tried to take me under. The quiet in the studio was thick now. Even the director in the booth, known for being stone cold during live broadcasts, had tears in her eyes. Morgan's voice trembled slightly. How do you know it wasn't just your mind trying to survive, creating comfort to keep you going? Keanu smiled faintly. Because I couldn't have made that up. I was too empty, too far gone. Whatever I felt in that room wasn't from me. It was for me. He added, he met me in my silence, and he hasn't left since. The words settled like a whisper across every ear in the studio. Morgan looked down at his notes, then quietly closed the folder. There would be no returning to scheduled questions. Something far more important had arrived. Morgan let the silence breathe. Then he leaned forward and said quietly, Keanu, I've interviewed a lot of people. I've heard a lot of stories. But I've never heard someone talk about grief like that. And I've never heard anyone talk about Jesus with such stillness. Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked off to the side, almost as if watching a memory play out behind the cameras. I think, he said slowly, that when people go through something devastating, they either build walls around themselves or they dig wells. Either way, they're looking for protection or water. Morgan's brow furrowed thoughtfully. And you? I tried the walls first, Keanu admitted. Anger, detachment, pretending I didn't care. But the grief always leaked through the cracks, so eventually, I just dropped the bricks. I stopped trying to protect myself and let myself feel everything. He gave a small, raw laugh. That's when he found me. Not when I was strong. When I finally stopped pretending to be. The words didn't come from a man trying to sound wise. They came from someone who had nothing to prove. Morgan was quiet again. Then he asked a question that sounded more like confession than curiosity. Why would Jesus care about us, about our pain? Why would he show up for someone like you or me? Keanu's answer was immediate. Because that's who he is. He doesn't wait for you to clean yourself up. He doesn't need you to be impressive. He just loves you, not in a soft romantic way, in a way that stays, in a way that sits beside your bed when you haven't slept for 3 nights and don't even know what to say. He paused, then added, that night, in the chapel, I didn't ask for a miracle. I asked not to be alone, and he answered. Morgan stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable but deeply moved. You've never told this story before, have you? Keanu shook his head. Not publicly. A few close friends maybe, but never like this. Where am I now? Keanu exhaled slowly. Because I think someone's watching right now who's where I was, sitting in the dark, not asking for religion or answers, just for someone to see them. I don't have a sermon for them, I just have this testimony. Morgan sat back, looking both shaken and thoughtful. It's not what I expected today. I didn't expect it either, Keanu said quietly, but I stopped living by scripts a long time ago. In the control room, no one spoke. Not one button was pressed. No notes were given. Everyone, producers, editors, lighting techs, sat frozen, eyes fixed on the screen. Even the stagehands had stopped moving. A sound operator quietly slipped off his headphones and whispered to no one in particular, This isn't an interview. This is something holy. Back in the studio, Keanu looked into Morgan's eyes one more time and said the line that would echo across television screens for weeks to come. Jesus met me in my silence, and he hasn't left since. And at that moment, not a single person watching, whether in the studio or across the country, doubted that it was true. Morgan leaned back slightly in his chair, but his expression was far from relaxed. Something in him had shifted. His voice, once steady and poised for broadcast, now carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't the voice of a host steering a conversation. It was the voice of a man who had just been stirred awake. He cleared his throat and said, "You know, Keanu, I've played God. I've narrated stories about miracles, faith, divine judgment, but I've never felt close to any of it. Not really." Keanu didn't respond. He just listened. "I've always thought," Morgan continued, "that belief was something people clung to so they wouldn't fall apart. Like a mental survival trick." He looked down for a moment, pressing his thumb into his palm, as if grounding himself. "But hearing you talk," he said slowly, "it doesn't sound like a survival trick. It sounds like a relationship." Keanu nodded. "It is." Morgan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you really feel like someone hears you when you pray?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "Every time," he said. Morgan blinked, surprised by the clarity of the answer. "Not always in words," Keanu added, "but in peace. In how I'm able to breathe again when I felt like I couldn't. In the moments when I don't have the strength to keep going, but somehow still do." The older man studied him for a long second. "What if you're just reaching into yourself?" Keanu's response was gentle. "Then I wouldn't feel someone reaching back." Morgan was silent. "I don't always hear anything," Keanu continued. "I don't always get clarity. Sometimes it's just the quiet. But there's a presence in that quiet, a knowing. And that's how I know I'm not talking to the ceiling." Morgan looked down, his face unreadable. Keanu waited. Then Morgan looked up, and his voice softened into something deeply personal. "I've had questions my whole life," he said. "I've read the Bible. I've read the Quran. I've read philosophy and watched preachers and traveled to temples and mosques and churches. And I've always admired the poetry of it. But I never felt wanted." Keanu leaned in just a little, his posture shifting without words. "I thought maybe I had to become someone different for God to want to meet me," Morgan said. "Someone more faithful, more obedient, more certain." Keanu's reply came with quiet conviction. "That's the lie a lot of us believe," he said, "that we have to fix ourselves before we come to Him. But Jesus didn't wait for people to become holy. He walked right into their mess." Morgan's eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked it away. "Even someone like me?" "Especially someone like you," Keanu answered. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Morgan folded his hands together, slowly rubbing his thumbs in a small, nervous circle. The cameras were still rolling, but they no longer seemed relevant. He wasn't performing. He wasn't probing. He was searching. "I used to think," Morgan said, "that if there was a God, he probably had better things to do than deal with me. I've lived a long life. I've made mistakes. I've doubted a lot more than I've believed." Keanu didn't interrupt. Morgan's voice grew more introspective. "When I was a boy, I went to church because I was supposed to, because my mother told me to. But even then, I didn't feel anything. Just formality. Ritual. Like God was somewhere far away, and the preacher was just waving smoke signals, hoping for a response." He looked over at Keanu with tired, searching eyes. "You talk about Jesus like someone you've actually met. That's what gets me. That's what makes me sit here, wondering." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's how he came to me. Not as a doctrine, not through a sermon, just presence." Morgan's eyebrows tightened slightly. "But how do you know it wasn't just emotion or trauma? Grief can make you feel a lot of strange things." Keanu's response came slowly, carefully. "Because it didn't come from me. I didn't even want to believe at that point. I wasn't looking for hope. I wasn't looking for healing. I was just trying to stay alive without breaking down in public." He paused. "But the peace came anyway," Morgan whispered. "And it stayed?" Keanu nodded. "Not always as a feeling, but always as a knowing. There were days I couldn't feel anything. When the sadness was too thick, But even then, I knew he hadn't left. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Morgan. "You've spent your life telling stories, Morgan. You know when something is being performed and when something is just true." Morgan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Keanu went on. Jesus didn't come to build a religion. He came to love people, broken people, angry people, doubtful people, people like me, people like you. Morgan sat back in his chair, his breath shallow and his eyes a little glassy. "For a long time," he said quietly, "I've wondered if maybe God was something people imagined because they were too afraid of the silence." Keanu looked at him with deep empathy, and for a long time, I wondered if maybe silence was the only thing waiting for me. He paused, then added, "But when I sat in that chapel and whispered to a God I wasn't even sure existed, the silence didn't echo back. It held me." Morgan closed his eyes for a moment, then looked down at his hands. "And what if I want that?" he said softly. "Not the rituals, not the rules, just that stillness, that knowing." Keanu didn't hesitate. Then, "He already wants you more." Morgan looked up, startled. "What?" Keanu smiled faintly. "You're not chasing him. He's already been chasing you." The words landed gently, but they cracked something open. Morgan sat very still, letting the truth settle in. No more questions. Just listening. Morgan didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was softer than before, but steadier too. Like something inside him had started to shift. "You know what's strange?" he said. "I've spent my whole life using my voice to make people feel something. I've read scripts that moved audiences to tears. I've told stories about God, faith, redemption. But I've never believed one of them applied to me. Not really." Keanu nodded, listening without interrupting. "I could talk about God all day," Morgan continued, "but I never thought he'd want to talk to me. I was the narrator, not the recipient." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Maybe that's the very reason he's been waiting." Morgan looked over, confused. "What do you mean?" Keanu's tone was calm but filled with conviction. "You've been the voice the world listens to, Morgan. But maybe God's been waiting for a moment when you stop narrating and start receiving." Morgan blinked slowly. "That's not something I ever thought I'd hear." "You said you've told stories that made people cry," Keanu said gently. "But when's the last time someone told you that you're loved? Not for your voice, not for your career, not for your wisdom, just you." Morgan lowered his eyes. Keanu's voice softened even more. "Jesus doesn't want your resume, Morgan. He wants your heart." The room was so quiet, the tension so still, it felt as though even time had stopped to listen. Morgan finally looked up again. "What does that even look like? What does it mean to give him your heart?" Keanu answered without pause. "It means being honest, not polished, not holy, just honest. You don't need to climb a mountain. You just need to turn toward him." Morgan stared at the floor for a long moment, then murmured, "I don't even know how." "You just say what you feel," Keanu said, "the same way you just spoke to me." Morgan let out a breath, almost like a quiet sigh. "All these years, I thought I had to study God to earn the right to approach him." Keanu's face was filled with compassion. "That's not who Jesus is. He never said, 'Get everything figured out, then come to me.' He just said, 'Come.'" A tear formed in the corner of Morgan's eye, but he didn't brush it away. Keanu added, "And he's still saying it, right now, to you." Morgan slowly turned his face toward the ceiling lights above, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've carried so much doubt, so much weight." Keanu responded with gentle truth. "And none of it disqualifies you. It's actually what draws him in closer." Morgan looked at him, his voice thick. "You really believe that?" Keanu nodded. "I do, because I've lived it." Morgan sat very still. Then finally, he said the words no one expected to hear. Not from a legend, not on live TV, not like this. "I want to believe," he said. "I really do." Keanu didn't move. "Then that's the beginning." "And he'll meet me here?" Morgan asked. Keanu smiled. "He already has." Morgan leaned back slightly in his chair, visibly moved by what had just passed between them. But before he could ask another question, Keanu spoke again, almost as if sensing what was coming. "I need to tell you something, Morgan," he said quietly. "Something I've never talked about publicly." Morgan nodded, encouraging him to continue. "There's a side of my life no one sees," Keanu began. "Not because I'm hiding it, but because it's not about cameras or attention. It's about worship." Morgan raised his eyebrows slightly, intrigued. "For the last 10 years, Keanu continued, I've been going to a little chapel in the hills just outside the city. It's open early, before sunrise. I drive out there alone, sit in the back pew, and pray. No one knows. No one asks for pictures. It's just sacred space." Morgan said nothing, but his eyes were locked. "Sometimes I light candles. Sometimes I just sit there in silence. I've read the Gospels dozens of times in that same wooden seat. Not because I'm trying to be religious, but because I want to understand the heart of the man who saved mine." Keanu paused, letting the words breathe. "And it didn't stop there," he added. "Over the years, I started doing hospital visits, quietly. I never announced it. I never brought anyone with me. I just found out where people were hurting and showed up." Morgan blinked. "You mean like children's hospitals?" Keanu nodded. "And hospices, burn units, cancer wards. I'd sit by someone's bed, hold their hand, sometimes just listen to them cry. I wouldn't tell them who I was. It didn't matter. I just wanted them to know they weren't alone." Morgan sat back, stunned. Keanu continued. "Some pastors found out. They started asking if I'd help fund certain things. New roofs for old churches, outreach centers, addiction recovery shelters. I said yes, but I told them there was one condition. No plaques, no dedications. Just do the work and give God the credit." Morgan looked away for a moment, overcome. "I didn't want recognition," Keanu said. "I wanted obedience." Morgan looked back at him. "Why?" Keanu answered without hesitation. "Because I know what it's like to be healed in secret, and I wanted to be part of doing that for others." A pause stretched out between them. "I'm not a preacher, Morgan," Keanu said softly. "I'm not a theologian. I'm just someone who's been rescued. And I spend my life now looking for ways to pass that rescue along." Morgan sat motionless, taking in what he had just heard. He had expected an interview. He was getting a glimpse behind the curtain. Morgan finally found his voice again, but it came out slower now, more reverent. "You've done all of this and said nothing?" Keanu nodded gently, "Because the moment I make it about me, it stops being ministry. It becomes PR." Morgan let out a quiet exhale, then asked, "So why are you talking about it now?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "Because if it helps someone trust that Jesus meets people in the shadows, then I don't mind stepping out of mine." Morgan leaned forward slightly, clearly moved. "It's one thing to act like a hero in movies, but this is different." Keanu smiled faintly. "People think I play heroes," he said, "but I follow one." The words landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. It wasn't just humility, it was truth, and Morgan felt it deep in his bones. Keanu continued, voice low and steady. "You know, acting used to be a way to escape, to disappear into someone else's story so I didn't have to face my own. But after I came to faith, something changed. Acting became ministry." Morgan looked intrigued. "How do you mean?" "I started seeing every character as a window into the human condition," Keanu said. "Grief, anger, redemption, sacrifice. These aren't just dramatic arcs. They're spiritual truths people carry in their real lives." He paused. "When I played John Wick, I wasn't glorifying vengeance. I was exploring what happens when love is lost and the soul goes numb. When I played Neo, I wasn't pretending to be a messiah. I was wrestling with the question, what if someone told you the world you live in is a lie, and there's a deeper truth waiting? Morgan listened without blinking. After I started following Jesus, Keanu said, I couldn't step into those roles the same way. Every line, every scene, it became a question. Am I portraying truth or just echoing pain? Morgan sat in stunned silence. Keanu leaned back just slightly. I'm not saying every movie I've done was perfect, far from it. But I began to approach each project differently. I prayed before scenes. I asked God to use even broken scripts to reflect His light, even just a little. Morgan looked at him with a mix of wonder and disbelief. You mean you prayed on set? Keanu nodded. Quietly, alone, in trailers, behind buildings, between takes. Sometimes with other crew members who asked. Sometimes with people who were angry or afraid and just needed someone to listen. He added, I've had more raw conversations about God with grips and set decorators than I've ever had with celebrities. Morgan's expression softened. That doesn't surprise me. Keanu gave a humble smile. God doesn't need a stage, He needs willing hearts, and film sets are full of people who are searching, just like everywhere else. The weight of his words filled the room. Morgan finally said, You've been living a kind of silent gospel. Keanu looked him in the eye. I've been trying. And now? Morgan asked. Keanu's voice was calm but clear. Now it's time to stop being silent. Morgan sat back, visibly shaken. There was a look in his eyes Keanu hadn't seen earlier. Not skepticism, not doubt. Something deeper. A kind of awe that comes when a person realizes they've just been invited into holy ground. You've been doing this for years, Morgan said, almost to himself. All while the world thought they knew who you were. Keanu nodded once. That's the thing about the world. It knows the headlines, but not the heart. Morgan rubbed his hands together slowly, processing. So many people think they need a stage to make an impact. But you chose the shadows. Keanu answered softly. Because that's where Jesus met me, and that's where He still walks. Morgan's throat tightened. What drives you now? What keeps you going? Keanu sat in stillness for a moment, then answered, There's this moment in the Gospels where Jesus looks over the crowd, and it says, He was moved with compassion, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He paused. That's how I see people now. Whether I'm sitting in a hospital room or filming on location, I see people who are tired, lost, trying to carry everything on their own. And I think, if Jesus could use someone like me to carry just a piece of their burden, then I'm in. Morgan didn't know what to say. He had planned to host an interview. Instead, he was being ministered to, live on national television. Keanu looked over at him and said, Fame can make people worship you, but Jesus taught me to serve instead. The words hit hard, not with volume, but with gravity. Morgan let out a quiet breath. You know, I always thought the bravest thing about you was your ability to keep your life private, but I think I was wrong. Keanu tilted his head, listening. Morgan continued, I think the bravest thing you've done is share all this now, not knowing how people will react. Keanu's expression softened. I stopped living for their reaction a long time ago. Now, I just live to obey the one who never walked away. A long silence followed. Morgan looked around the studio, then back at Keanu. I think the audience came here today to learn about your film, but I think they just met your faith. Keanu didn't smile for the camera. He just said quietly, That's the only story I care about telling now. And in that moment, Morgan Freeman, who had played God in so many films, sat speechless in the presence of a man who followed him in real life. Morgan looked at Keanu, still stunned by the testimony he'd just heard. But it was the silence that followed that said the most. Keanu sat calmly, not performing, not pushing, just waiting for whatever came next. But instead of asking another question, Morgan said, "You talk about Jesus with so much certainty now. But was there ever a time you wanted to walk away from everything? From the industry? From the faith?" Keanu nodded without hesitation. "Yes, there was a time I almost left it all behind." Morgan leaned in. "What happened?" Keanu took a breath, then spoke slowly. "It was 5 years ago. I was working on a film overseas and something in me just broke. I couldn't fake it anymore. Not the smiles, not the interviews, not the roles. Everything started to feel hollow." He paused, remembering. I'd lost another friend to suicide a few months earlier. I'd been running on fumes for years, pouring myself into roles, burying myself in work. I thought I was surviving, but I was just postponing the collapse. Morgan's voice dropped. "So what did you do?" "I disappeared," Keanu said. "I told my agent I needed time. No press, no scripts. I rented a small cabin in the woods 2 hours outside of Vancouver. No phone, no internet, just trees, snow, and silence." Morgan's eyebrows lifted. "Alone?" Keanu nodded. "Completely." For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he added, "I thought maybe I'd leave the business for good. Maybe I'd sell everything, move somewhere no one knew me, and just start over." "And did you?" Morgan asked. Keanu shook his head slowly. "I brought one thing with me I hadn't touched in years. A Bible. It was a gift from a director I'd worked with when I was younger. I'd kept it out of respect, but I never opened it." Morgan whispered, "Until then." Keanu nodded again. "It was my 3rd night in that cabin. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts were racing, and I remember sitting in front of the fire, holding that Bible in my hands. I said, 'God, I don't know what I'm looking for, but if you're real, please speak.'" He paused again. "I opened it at random. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but my eyes landed on a verse in the book of Matthew." Morgan leaned in closer. It said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The words lingered in the space between them. Keanu's voice softened. I'd heard that verse before, but I had never felt it before. That night, I did. Morgan sat motionless, absorbing the verse that had cracked open something in Keanu's spirit. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. Finally, Morgan spoke, barely above a whisper. "You were weary." Keanu looked straight at him. "I was exhausted, not just physically, soul tired. I'd been carrying everything alone for too long." He let the words breathe, then continued. "People saw the movies, the premieres, the press tours, but what they didn't see was the weight I was dragging behind all that. The loneliness, the questions, the nights when I couldn't sleep because I didn't know who I was anymore outside of work." Morgan asked gently, "And that one verse, it reached you?" Keanu nodded. "It didn't just reach me, it held me. I read it over and over again, that one sentence. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe an hour, maybe 5. I cried so hard that night, I couldn't breathe." Morgan looked down at the table between them. "And you prayed?" "For the first time in years," Keanu said. "A real prayer, not one from memory or obligation. Just me, telling God I didn't have anything left, that I was empty, that if He wanted me, He could have me, but I had nothing to offer." His voice trembled slightly. "I told Him I didn't want to be famous, I didn't want to be rich, I just wanted rest. I just wanted peace. I said, 'Jesus, if you're real, I need you, please come.'" Keanu glanced down at his lap, then back at Morgan. "That night I fell asleep on the floor next to the fireplace. I didn't even make it to the bed." Morgan asked, "Did anything happen when you woke up?" Keanu nodded slowly. I opened my eyes with tears on my face. Not from sadness, from something deeper. It felt like something had been washed out of me. Morgan whispered, "You felt clean." "That's the only word I have for it," Keanu said. "I felt like someone had poured water into my soul, not to erase the pain, but to restore what the pain had taken." He added, "For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone." Morgan sat quietly. "Did you stay there long?" Keanu nodded. "I stayed another week. I read the Gospels every day, slowly. I wasn't analyzing them, I was letting them speak. I cried through most of it. But they weren't just stories anymore. They were letters written to me." Morgan leaned forward, eyes fixed. "And what did that time teach you?" Keanu paused, then answered, "That surrender isn't weakness. It's the only way to stop drowning." He let that settle before adding, "I used to think I had to be strong for everyone else, but I found my real strength the moment I said, 'I can't do this anymore.' And instead of shame, what I got back was grace." Morgan's voice was thick with emotion. "That's not the kind of story people expect from someone like you." "I know," Keanu said softly, "but it's the only story I care to tell." Morgan sat quietly, visibly moved. He looked down at his notes, the ones he hadn't touched in nearly half an hour, and gently pushed them aside. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried something new, reverence mixed with longing. "I've spent my life interviewing people," he said. "I've heard stories of success, tragedy, reinvention, but this feels different." Keanu gave a small nod, not in pride but in understanding. Morgan continued, "I think what strikes me most is how unpolished it is. You didn't have a 10-step spiritual breakthrough. You didn't follow a formula. You just broke." Keanu's voice was quiet. "That's where most of us meet God, I think. Not when we're strong, when we're undone." Morgan studied him. "So, when you left that cabin, were you changed?" Keanu took a breath. "I didn't walk out glowing. I wasn't suddenly fearless or free from pain, but I walked out different, calmer, anchored. I had questions, but I also had peace." He added, "And I knew I didn't want to go back to a life where I was carrying everything alone." Morgan's voice was filled with quiet wonder. "And Jesus? He became more than just a name?" Keanu looked at him, firm but tender. "He became my friend, my healer, my guide. He wasn't part of my belief system. He was the system." Morgan exhaled slowly, as if he was letting go of something heavy. "I've spent years reading spiritual texts," he said. "I've read about meditation, mindfulness, sacred energy. But what you're describing, this isn't philosophy. It's personal." Keanu nodded. "Because he's personal. He's not an idea. He's a person. And he's not waiting for us to figure everything out. He's just waiting for us to turn toward him." Morgan fell silent again, visibly absorbing the weight of that truth. Keanu leaned forward. "You don't have to believe everything perfectly to talk to him. You don't even have to be sure. You just have to be honest." Morgan's voice wavered slightly. "But what if I come to him with doubts?" Keanu smiled gently. "Then you're bringing him something real. He doesn't want your performance, he wants your truth." There was a long pause. Morgan's next words were whispered. "I think I've been afraid to talk to him because I didn't want to hear nothing back." Keanu looked at him with warmth in his eyes. "Then maybe. He's been waiting for you to say that. Because sometimes what feels like silence is actually stillness. And in that stillness, he speaks. Just differently." Morgan sat back, his hands folded in his lap. He looked around the studio, almost surprised to remember where he was. "People think strength is about being sure," he said. "But maybe it's about being willing." Keanu nodded. "That's where everything changed for me. Not when I had it figured out, but when I whispered, "I'm willing, even if I don't understand." That's when he showed up. Morgan met his eyes. "And you've never been the same since," Keanu answered with quiet certainty, "not even close." And in that moment, Morgan Freeman, who had built a legacy out of lending his voice to the most powerful characters on Earth, sat in complete silence, overwhelmed by the power of something far greater than words. Morgan sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the interview began, he seemed unsure of where to go next. His eyes drifted off camera, searching the air for something he hadn't yet said. Then, quietly, he began to speak. "You know, Keanu, I've spent my life around religion. Grew up in the South, Bible Belt, churches on every corner, people dressed in their Sunday best, preachers who knew how to stir a crowd." Keanu listened without a word. "But even as a kid," Morgan continued, "something didn't sit right. I'd sit in church pews hearing about love, mercy, kindness, then walk outside and see those same people ignoring my mother in a store because of her skin, or crossing the street when my father walked by." He looked down at his hands. "They called it God's house, but it didn't feel like home." Keanu's face remained still, but his eyes were filled with compassion. "I started asking questions early," Morgan said. "If God is love, then why didn't his people love us? If Jesus cared about the poor and the hurting, why did the church treat us like shadows? I wanted to believe, but I couldn't square the gospel with the hate I saw." Keanu gave a small nod, still silent. Morgan took a breath. "Over time, I started pulling back, not from the idea of God, but from religion. I told myself maybe God was real, but he had lousy followers." He gave a dry smile. "That's how I justified the distance." Keanu leaned in slightly, his voice soft. "You were protecting your heart." Morgan looked up at him, surprised by the phrasing. Keanu added, "It makes sense. If you only ever saw love weaponized, why would you want anything to do with it?" Morgan's jaw tightened. "Exactly." A pause followed. Then Keanu asked gently, "But can I ask you something?" Morgan nodded cautiously. "Have you ever told Jesus that?" Keanu said. The question hung in the air. Morgan blinked, caught off guard. "Told him what?" he asked. Keanu didn't flinch. "That you saw hypocrisy in his name, that it hurt, that it made you walk away. Have you ever said that to him? Not to people, not in interviews, but directly to him?" Morgan leaned back, clearly unsettled. "I don't know," he said. "I've said it about him. I've said it to friends. But to Jesus? No, I don't think I have." Keanu nodded gently. Maybe that's where the conversation starts. Morgan was silent again, visibly processing. The weight of that single question lingered longer than any sermon ever could. Morgan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. His voice lowered, as if speaking through decades of memory. "I remember being 10 years old, walking past a white church with stained glass windows," he said. "I looked inside once, just for a second. There was music, laughter, people hugging each other. But I knew I wasn't welcome." Keanu said nothing, giving him space. "I didn't understand it then," Morgan continued. "I just knew what exclusion felt like. Later, I learned the language for it: segregation, institutional racism. But as a child, all I knew was that the God they talked about didn't seem interested in a boy who looked like me." He glanced up briefly, then back down again. "I've carried that feeling for a long time." Keanu asked gently, "Did anyone ever show you a different kind of faith? One that didn't come with conditions?" Morgan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was one pastor. He ran a small, rundown church on the edge of town. Wooden pews, peeling paint, no choir, just an old piano and a handful of people who really believed. He let me sit in the front row. Called me son. Told me God made me on purpose. Keanu's eyes softened. What happened to him? Hell. Died when I was a teenager, Morgan said. Heart failure. That was the last time I regularly set foot in a church. Keanu waited, then asked, Did you ever wonder why that church felt different? Morgan nodded. Because it felt like truth lived there. No show, no performance, just people trying to love each other. I remember thinking, if God was real, maybe he lived in places like that. Not the cathedrals, the corners. Keanu's voice came gently. Maybe that was Jesus, trying to get through. Morgan looked at him, surprised. Keanu continued, You said your doubts were never really about God's existence, just his goodness. But maybe those small moments, like that pastor, that little church, maybe they were his answers all along. Not loud, not obvious, just enough to keep the door cracked. Morgan exhaled, his hands now loosely clasped. I've always said I respect faith, he admitted, but I've never trusted it, because it's tied to people, and people fail. Keanu nodded slowly. They do. I've failed more than I can count. But Jesus isn't people. He stepped into the mess, himself, and he never failed. Morgan looked straight at him. You really believe that? I do, Keanu said, because I've met him in my own mess, and he never turned away. Morgan leaned back, voice heavy. I think I'd been mad at him for a long time. Not for what he did, but for what people did in his name. Keanu said quietly, and he knows that. He's heard it, even when you didn't say it. But he's not offended. He's just waiting. Waiting for what? Morgan asked. For you to finally talk to him. Morgan looked stunned for a moment. Then something inside him softened. I wouldn't know what to say. Start with what you just said to me, Keanu replied. That's more honest than most prayers I've ever heard. Morgan sat in silence for a long time, his gaze distant, his breath steady but deep. The cameras continued rolling, but no one on set dared move or break the sacred rhythm of the moment. Finally, Morgan spoke again. You know, he said slowly, for years, I thought I needed to forgive the church, the systems, the pastors who looked away while people suffered. But sitting here with you, I think I needed to forgive God. Keanu didn't flinch. You're not the only one who's felt that way. Morgan looked at him. But isn't that blasphemy, to even think that? Keanu shook his head gently. No, it's relationship. You can't have a real one without honesty. You can tell Jesus anything. Your anger, your doubt, your disappointment. He doesn't pull away. He leans in. Morgan's lips parted, but no words came for a moment. I always thought I had to come to God clean, he finally said. Strong, grateful, humble, but not bitter, Keanu responded calmly. But the Gospels are full of people who came to him messy. The woman at the well, the leper, the thief on the cross. None of them came clean. They came broken. And Jesus met them right there. Morgan's eyes were wet now, but he didn't wipe them. I've played men who lose everything. I've voiced stories about hope. But deep down, I've always feared I was outside the story. Like God could save them, but not me. Keanu leaned forward, voice low and steady. That's the lie, the one too many of us carry. But Jesus came for the outsider, the forgotten, the angry, the doubter, not just the holy. He paused, then added, especially the doubter. Morgan exhaled again. His chest seemed lighter. So, what you're saying is, I don't have to pretend anymore? Keanu smiled softly. Not in front of him. Never. A long silence followed. Then Morgan asked something quietly. Do you think he still wants me after all these years? Keanu's voice was firm and clear. More than ever. Morgan swallowed hard. Keanu looked at him and added, "You've been talking about him for decades. Maybe today is the first time you're ready to talk to him." Morgan's voice was barely above a whisper. "And what if I don't know how?" Keanu replied, "That's okay. Just start with where you are, what you feel, what you wish you didn't." Morgan's hands trembled slightly as he brought them together in his lap. Keanu offered gently, "You can say it out loud or silently. He hears both." Morgan closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and said, "Jesus, I'm sorry I waited so long, but if you're really there, I want to know you. I want to know you're good." Keanu didn't speak. He just bowed his head. "And I want to stop carrying all this," Morgan continued, his voice shaking. "The weight, the anger, the fear." A few tears slid down his face. "I don't want to be alone anymore," he whispered. When he opened his eyes again, Keanu met them with compassion. "Heard you," Keanu said. "That's the beginning." Morgan let out a long, trembling breath. "It feels like something broke open." "No," Keanu said gently. "Something broke free." The air in the studio had changed. It wasn't just emotional. It was sacred. Morgan Freeman sat with his hands still folded, eyes open now but softened. His face bore the quiet marks of someone who had just released something heavy, a weight he had carried not for days or years, but decades. Across from him, Keanu Reeves sat calmly, patiently, with a peace that didn't demand anything but offered everything. Morgan looked around briefly, remembering that the lights were still on, the cameras still rolling, the world still watching. Then he looked back at Keanu. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Keanu smiled gently. "Now, you keep going. You keep talking to him. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't need a 10 Mois plan or the perfect theology." He paused, then added, "Jesus doesn't need you to be certain. He just asks you to come." Morgan exhaled, as if those words alone unlocked something deeper inside him. Keanu leaned in slightly, not with pressure, but with purpose. "Would it be okay if I prayed for you?" Morgan looked stunned for a moment, glancing toward the cameras instinctively. "Right now?" Keanu nodded. "If you're comfortable. If you want to." Morgan looked around again, catching the eye of the studio producer just beyond the glass. She looked torn, uncertain whether to let this unfold. There were networks involved, advertisers watching, millions tuned in. This wasn't scripted. It wasn't pre-approved. But after a moment of hesitation, she gave a slow, silent nod. Keanu turned back to Morgan. "We don't have to make it formal," he said gently. "No performance, just two men talking to a God who already knows us." Morgan looked down for a beat, then back up again. "Would you lead it?" Keanu smiled. "I'd be honored." Then he paused. But before speaking, he looked into Morgan's eyes one more time. "Would you like to talk to him together?" he asked softly. The question hung in the air, like a thread of eternity woven into the present moment. Morgan didn't answer right away. His throat moved as he swallowed the emotion rising within him. Then he gave a small nod. His voice was almost silent. "Yes." And just like that, what had started as an interview became something else entirely. Something no one could have predicted. Something real. Keanu gently reached out his hands across the space between them. Morgan hesitated only for a moment before placing his hands in Keanu's. The room fell into a reverent hush. Even the sound of the cameras seemed to fade. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment and took a slow, deep breath. Morgan sat opposite him, his hands trembling slightly in Keanu's. The world around them faded. There was no audience anymore. No studio lights, no fame, just two men, one searching, the other gently leading the way. Keanu began speaking in a calm, reverent tone. "Jesus," he said quietly, We come to you right now, not with fancy words or polished faith, but with open hearts. You know us. You see us. You've walked with us through every question, every moment of pain, every time we've felt forgotten. Morgan remained still, his eyes now closed, his grip tightening slightly. Keanu continued, "Thank you for never giving up on us, for loving us before we ever said your name, for standing in the background of our lives, waiting for the day we'd finally turn around and realize you were always there." The kitchen door that just opened. The entire crew stood frozen. No one moved. Even the control room, normally buzzing with technical commands, had fallen completely silent. "God," Keanu said, "you know Morgan. You've known him since before he took his first breath. You gave him his voice, his mind, his ability to tell stories that touch the world. But more than that, you've seen the quiet parts, the questions he never said out loud, the wounds he tried to bury." Morgan's chest rose slowly, his shoulders tense with emotion. "Tonight," Keanu whispered, "he's saying yes to you, not because he has it all figured out, not because he's sure of everything, but because he's tired of running and ready to be held." A tear slipped down Morgan's cheek. Keanu paused, letting the moment breathe. "Jesus," he said softly, "would you meet him here? Not with pressure, not with judgment, just with love. Let him feel your peace. Let him know he's seen. Let him know he's not too late." Morgan suddenly spoke, voice trembling but steady. "I've waited my whole life to feel this," he said. "And I didn't even know it." Keanu gently responded, "That's because your soul has always known him. It was just waiting for you to listen." Another pause. Then Morgan said slowly, "Jesus, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what you want from me, but I'm tired, and I want to know you. I want to believe you're as good as Keanu says you are." Keanu nodded. "That's the prayer. That's all he's been waiting for." Morgan took a shaky breath. "Then I'm saying yes. I'm saying yes to whatever this is, even if I don't understand it all." Keanu closed his eyes again and said, "Lord, you've heard every word. Now, would you fill the spaces between them? Would you pour your spirit into his heart? Heal what's been hurt. Restore what was lost. Speak louder than the lies he's believed." The room was still. No applause, no prompting, just raw, sacred surrender. Keanu finally whispered, "Amen." Morgan echoed softly, "Amen." They opened their eyes at the same time. Morgan blinked, stunned at what he felt. "There's something different," he said, his voice cracking. "It's like the air around me changed." Keanu smiled gently. "That's him." Morgan looked around the room, still gripping Keanu's hands. "I feel warm, peaceful, like something heavy just lifted." Keanu nodded. "It did." Morgan pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes. "I didn't think this would happen. Not here. Not like this." Keanu responded, "But it did, because God knew you were ready." Morgan let the words settle, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all evening. Then he looked into the camera, realizing once again that this was live, that millions had just witnessed the most personal moment of his life. "I don't know who's watching," he said, "but if you've ever felt like faith was for everyone else but you, let me tell you, I felt that way too." Keanu nodded in agreement. Morgan continued, "But tonight, I felt something, someone, and I know now that Jesus doesn't wait for you to be perfect. He just wants you to be honest." He looked back at Keanu. "Thank you for leading me here." Keanu shook his head gently. "I didn't lead you. He did. I just pointed." Morgan turned back to the camera. "If you're tired," he said, "if you're full of questions, don't let that stop you. Just say something. Even if all you can say is, 'Help.' That's enough." He placed a hand on his chest, overcome. "I've said a lot of words in my life," Morgan whispered. "But this is the first time they felt like they reached heaven." And in that moment, every person watching knew they had just witnessed something eternal. Morgan's hands were still resting in his lap when he looked over at Keanu and said, barely above a whisper, "Yes, let's pray." The moment felt suspended in time. Every viewer at home, every crew member on set, and every soul who had casually tuned in, expecting a typical Sunday interview, suddenly found themselves caught in a moment too sincere to ignore. This wasn't a headline. This wasn't a stunt. This was a sacred intersection of vulnerability and divine presence. Live on national television, Keanu nodded with quiet reverence, then gently reached out again. Morgan placed his hands in Keanu's. They were trembling now, not out of fear, but from the weight of what was happening. Keanu bowed his head and began to speak, not with eloquence, not with practiced polish, but with the rawness of someone who knew the presence of the one he was addressing. "Jesus," he said softly, "thank you for knowing us, even when we don't know you." Morgan closed his eyes, his breathing uneven, his chest rising slowly with each breath. His weathered hands gripped Keanu's tightly, as if anchoring himself to something deeper than the moment. Keanu continued, "Thank you for staying close, even when we've walked far. Thank you for loving us, not because we earned it, but because you never stopped seeing us." Morgan's lips began to move, not speaking out loud, but mouthing the words in sync. "God, I pray for Morgan right now," Keanu said gently. "For every doubt, every wound, every disappointment, for every moment when he thought you were silent, thank you that you were still near." A tear slid down Morgan's face. Keanu's voice trembled just slightly as he went on. "You know the weight he's carried, the questions, the ache to be seen and known and loved. And now, here, in this moment, you're showing him that he always was." In the background, one of the boom mic operators lowered his gear. A cameraman removed his headset. The lighting technician, usually focused on color temperature and lens shadows, had tears in her eyes. Keanu didn't try to impress anyone with his words. He didn't perform. He simply prayed. "I ask you, Lord, to wrap your presence around Morgan like a blanket, to remind him, even after this broadcast ends, that you're still listening, that you're still close." Morgan's shoulders shook gently, his eyes still closed, his heart fully open. Keanu finished, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you, Jesus, for welcoming all of us, just as we are, for not waiting for us to be strong, for loving us in our weakness, for being the answer when all we had were questions." He paused, then added quietly, "We give you this moment, not for cameras, not for applause, but because you're worthy, because you've always been waiting." And then, with the softest voice, he said, "Amen." Morgan echoed him. "Amen." The studio was frozen, not out of shock, but out of reverence. Something had passed through the room, and no one dared to be the first to move. The stillness after the prayer was unlike anything the studio had experienced. Not silent in the absence of sound, but silent in the presence of something greater. Morgan slowly opened his eyes. They were red around the edges, but filled with something different now. Not weariness, not hesitation, but peace. "I don't even know what just happened," he whispered, looking over at Keanu. "But it felt real. More real than anything I've done in years." Keanu didn't try to explain it. He just nodded, because it was. Morgan's hands were still trembling slightly as he let go of Keanu's. He leaned back in his chair, visibly overwhelmed, wiping a tear from his cheek. "I've read lines that moved people to tears," he said softly, "but nothing I've ever spoken has moved me like that prayer did." Keanu leaned forward, his tone low and gentle. Because that wasn't performance. That was presence. The phrase struck Morgan like lightning. He gave a faint nod, letting the weight of those words settle over him. In the control booth, no one had resumed directing. No one gave instructions. The broadcast was still live, but no one was rushing to fill airtime. Every person behind the scenes knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. Morgan looked around the studio slowly, as if seeing it with new eyes. "I didn't think I'd feel anything today," he admitted. "I thought I was too old, too set in my ways, too analytical. But something happened, Keanu. Something I can't explain." Keanu smiled. "You don't need to explain it, you just need to receive it." Morgan let out a shaky breath. "I've spent my whole life narrating other people's stories, but I think I just found the beginning of my own." "You've always had a story," Keanu said. "Now it's just unfolding in the direction it was meant to go." Morgan turned back toward the camera, his voice clearer now, though still marked with emotion. "To everyone watching this," he said slowly, "I want you to know, I came here expecting a conversation. What I got was an encounter." Keanu watched him closely. "I've carried questions about God for most of my life," Morgan continued. "But today, I didn't find answers. I found peace. And maybe that's even better." He sat up straighter, hands steady now. "If you're watching this and you're full of doubt," he said, "if you've been hurt by people who used God's name but didn't show His love, I want you to know something. He's not like them. He's better, kinder, closer." He turned to Keanu again. "Thank you for not preaching to me. Thank you for just being real." Keanu looked at him, eyes shining. "Thank you for being willing." As the lights dimmed slightly and the feed neared its final segment, there was no need for dramatic music or scripted farewells. The moment had already changed everything. For a long moment after the prayer, Morgan Freeman didn't say a word. He remained still, his head bowed slightly, his hands loose in his lap, as though the weight of what had just happened was too much to immediately name. The lights still glowed above, the cameras still captured every angle, but it all felt peripheral now. Background to something deeper. Keanu sat quietly across from him, waiting. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't rush it. He simply honored it. Then Morgan lifted his head slowly and looked over at Keanu, his eyes glassy but steady. "I felt something," he said quietly. "I don't know what it was, but it was real." Keanu met his gaze without blinking. "That's him," he said softly. "He shows up." Morgan let out a quiet, almost reverent breath. It was like I was being held, not by a feeling, not by an emotion, by a presence. Keanu nodded. "Because you were." Morgan looked down at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them differently. Then, after a long pause, he turned his eyes toward the camera. He didn't prepare himself. He didn't square his shoulders or rehearse his words. He just spoke. "I've never felt so seen," he said. The control room was completely still. The crew, many of whom had been working live TV for decades, had tears in their eyes. The lead producer, watching through the main monitor, wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt. She gave a silent wave to keep rolling. No one dared interrupt. Morgan continued, his voice steady now. "For most of my life, I've told stories. I've performed in front of cameras. I've narrated the journeys of others. But I've never told you mine, because I didn't know it until now." He looked over at Keanu again. "This man didn't try to convince me of anything," he said. "He didn't push, he didn't pressure, he just shared what was true for him. And somehow, it touched what was buried in me." Keanu sat quietly, hands resting gently on his knees. Morgan turned back to the camera. I want to say something to anyone watching who feels like faith is for other people, like peace belongs to everyone else. If that's you, I need you to know, Jesus didn't wait for me to get my life together. He didn't demand I fix everything first. He met me exactly where I was. He paused, letting the truth of that land. And I believe, Morgan said slowly, he'll do the same for you. From the floor crew to the director's booth, no one had ever witnessed a moment like this on live television. Keanu looked over, his voice warm and filled with gratitude. That's the gospel, Morgan. Not religion, not rules, just relationship. Morgan smiled faintly. And all this time, I thought I needed answers. He looked down, then back up. But it turns out, I just needed to be known. Keanu nodded slowly. That's where it starts for most of us, he said. Not with theology, not with a perfect prayer, just with that moment when we realize he sees us and loves us anyway. Morgan looked over at him, eyes still shining. You've carried this peace with you the whole time, haven't you? Keanu paused for a moment, then replied, I've carried him with me. The peace comes and goes with life's storms, but he never leaves. Morgan was quiet for a while, digesting that. Then he looked toward the crew, the people who had lit the set, checked his mic, arranged his chair. I wonder, he said, how many of you have felt this before and didn't know what to call it? No one answered out loud, but the silence said enough. In the control room, the producer put her hand over her mouth. Her assistant, usually stone-faced, was crying quietly behind the audio board. The executive director simply nodded when asked whether to keep the feed going. Something bigger than broadcast ratings was happening now. Morgan looked back at the camera and continued. You know, I've read a lot of scripts, and I've seen a lot of fake redemption stories. But this isn't that. This is something different. He took a deep breath. I feel alive, like something in me just woke up. Like I'd been carrying a voice for the world, but I'd forgotten what it meant to let God speak back. Keanu's voice was steady. That's what he does. He waits for the moment we're finally quiet enough to hear him. Morgan turned toward Keanu again. Why me, though? Why now? Keanu smiled softly. Because you're his. And because he knew you were ready. The weight of those words landed with a force that didn't need to be explained. Morgan looked back to the camera. I've had a good life, a full career, but if this moment is the only legacy I leave behind, I'm okay with that. Because for once, it's not about the story I told. It's about the truth I finally found. Keanu's eyes shimmered with emotion. You've found the beginning of the greatest story ever told. Morgan nodded slowly. And I think I want to spend the rest of my days getting to know the author. As the segment drew near its close, the room remained quiet. No wrap-up music, no teleprompter feed. Just two men, still sitting in the presence of something eternal. Morgan placed a hand on his chest once more. This isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of everything. And with that, the camera slowly zoomed out, not to create drama, but to gently release the audience from the holy moment they had just witnessed. In homes across the country, viewers didn't change the channel. They sat in silence, too, holding their breath, feeling the invisible presence that had made its way from a quiet studio in New York to hearts around the world. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. The interview was barely off the air when the internet exploded. Clips of the moment Keanu spoke about Jesus spread like wildfire. Within an hour, someone had trimmed the segment and posted it on social media with the caption, "Keanu just did this on live TV. Morgan Freeman's face says it all." The post got over 5 million views overnight. Comments flooded in. Some praised Keanu's courage. Others mocked it. But no one ignored it. By morning, it was the headline on multiple entertainment blogs. National news anchors discussed it with surprise. Pastors across the country began including it in their sermons. They played it during Sunday services, calling it a public declaration of faith in a time when most celebrities avoided anything that might alienate half the country. On the other side, some viewers were outraged. A few called it emotional manipulation. Others accused Keanu of exploiting faith for attention. But those who truly listened to the way he had spoken, calm, humble, and filled with compassion, could tell this wasn't a performance. It was a testimony. Meanwhile, Morgan Freeman went quiet. For a man known for his smooth narration and confident presence, he had nothing to say publicly. Not right away. His team issued a generic statement thanking Keanu for the conversation and calling the moment unplanned but important. But behind the scenes, Morgan was rattled. Something had cracked open. 3 days after the interview aired, Keanu received a call. The voice on the other end was gravelly, familiar, and unsteady. "I haven't stopped thinking about it," Morgan said quietly. Keanu paused. He didn't push. He just listened. "I want to know more," Morgan said. Keanu's response was simple. "Then come to dinner." That Sunday evening, Morgan arrived at Keanu's quiet home in the Hollywood Hills. No press, no cameras, just two men, both aging, both battle-scarred by life in different ways, sitting down at a small wooden table with a pot of soup and warm bread between them. On the table, beside the food, was a Bible. Keanu had opened it to the Gospel of John. Morgan raised an eyebrow when he saw it. "You planned this?" Keanu smiled. "Not a script, just something that changed me." They ate in silence for a while, then Keanu began to read. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The rhythm of the words washed over them. Morgan didn't interrupt. He just listened. There was something about hearing Scripture, not performed, not dramatized, but simply read aloud, that disarmed him. For the first time in a long time, he felt quiet inside. After a while, Morgan leaned back in his chair. "I've read these before, but they didn't sound like this." Keanu nodded. "They didn't sound like this to me either, not until I needed them." That line stuck with Morgan. He thought of the losses he rarely spoke of, the private pain that fame had never healed, the friends buried, the moments of silence between applause. He stayed late that night. Hours passed. The sun dipped low behind the hills. They read more from John. They talked about grief, about searching for meaning, about the difference between religion and relationship. And Morgan Freeman didn't leave with answers. He left with questions. But something had shifted. The next morning, Keanu found a short message on his phone. "Let's read again next week. Same place?" Keanu replied with just one word. "Always." Word began to spread quietly among those close to Morgan Freeman. Not the headlines, not the social media noise, just whispers. Assistants noticed he had canceled a few appearances, but seemed lighter in spirit. His longtime makeup artist said he'd been humming between takes, something he hadn't done in years. One of his oldest friends texted Keanu privately, "Whatever you're doing, don't stop." I haven't seen him like this since before his divorce. Keanu didn't respond with details. He didn't have any grand plan. He was simply showing up. Every week, without fail. They read under a dim lamp in Keanu's living room, sometimes for an hour, sometimes two. They didn't just stick to Scripture. They talked about the world, about pain, about why people are cruel, about why silence can be louder than shouts. And Morgan began to ask the kind of questions that scared him. What happens when we die? Does God really see everything? Why did he let certain things happen in my life? Keanu never gave packaged answers. He didn't try to be a pastor or a philosopher. He just shared what had helped him survive. How forgiveness had been his rescue rope. how grief had driven him to his knees, and how, in the stillness, Jesus had spoken not through thunder, but through peace. Morgan listened more than he spoke, but something new started to grow in him. He began rereading scripts differently. Roles that once felt shallow now bothered him. Characters that mocked belief or glorified darkness suddenly felt like missed chances. He called his agent and quietly passed on a few big offers. No one in the public knew why. But Keanu knew. One night, Morgan brought his own Bible. He was old, dusty, pages curled from years on a shelf. He placed it on the table without a word and flipped to the same book they'd been reading for weeks, John. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. "I forgot I had this," he said. "It was a gift from my grandmother." They sat in silence, sacred silence. That night, Keanu didn't read, Morgan did. His voice trembled at first, but as he read, it steadied. By the time he reached John 14, "Let not your heart be troubled," his tone had changed. He wasn't just reading. He was remembering something. A voice from his childhood, a presence he had once known, long before the fame and the distance and the masks. That was the first time he prayed aloud. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't polished, it was raw. "If you're still there, I want to come back." Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. The room felt different after that. Still, weightless. Morgan placed the Bible in his lap and whispered, "I think I'm starting to believe again." Keanu smiled. Then the seeds already planted. And just like that, the man whose voice had once narrated God in movies was now whispering to him in private. Not for show, not for applause, but because something real had begun. It had been exactly 6 weeks since the now famous live interview aired, the one where Keanu had spoken of Jesus, where Morgan Freeman had sat stunned, silent, visibly moved but unsure of what to say. The clip had gone viral, been debated, parodied, and praised, but the world hadn't seen what came after. What the headlines missed was the quiet revolution that had started in one man's soul. Then, without fanfare or promotion, CBS announced a follow-up segment. This time, Morgan Freeman would be the guest. The producers hadn't planned it. Morgan had requested it. There were no scripts, no expectations, just a chair waiting for him in the same studio, under the same lights. As the theme music faded and the host smiled to welcome viewers, the camera cut to Morgan, who sat calm and composed, but noticeably different. He wore no tie, just a soft sweater, simple slacks, and a cross barely visible under the collar of his shirt. The host leaned in, clearly curious. "Morgan, you asked to come back. What's been on your heart?" Morgan took a deep breath. "I've been quiet these last few weeks, but something's been happening inside me." There was a pause, then he continued. Obviously didn't expect it, but ever since that night with Keanu, I've been reading scripture daily. I've been praying in the morning, not because someone told me to, but because I woke up with questions I couldn't ignore. The audience was silent. No applause, just attention. "I started with doubt," he said, "but I found love." He looked up, his eyes steady. "For the first time in my life, I'm exploring faith seriously. Not as a role, not as a performance, just as a man who's been given more chances than he deserves." The host asked, gently, "What changed for you?" Morgan nodded slowly. "I saw something in Keanu that night. Something that wasn't about being right or being famous. It was about peace. And I wanted that. So, I followed the thread." He glanced off camera and smiled. The camera followed his gaze. There, sitting off stage, was Keanu Reeves. The crowd erupted in applause as Keanu stood and walked toward the seat next to Morgan. But Keanu didn't wave or soak it in. He simply placed a hand on Morgan's shoulder before sitting beside him. The host looked between them. "Keanu, did you know this was going to happen?" Keanu gave a soft smile. "I knew something was happening, but not this." Morgan turned to him, visibly moved. "You didn't push. You just sat with me. You let me ask hard questions. You let the silence be holy." Keanu nodded. "That's what Jesus did for me, so that's what I wanted to offer you." Morgan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn Bible, the same one his grandmother had given him decades ago. He held it up without a word. The host's voice cracked slightly. That's a beautiful moment." Morgan looked directly into the camera. "There are people watching right now who feel the way I did, doubtful, disconnected, angry. I want them to know it's okay to question. It's okay to be late to the table. What matters is showing up." Morgan adjusted the Bible in his hands, holding it gently now, like something sacred. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "But I have peace. Not a fake kind, not the kind that comes from applause or praise, a quiet kind. The kind that stays even when everything else gets loud." The studio was still. Even the crew seemed frozen in place. Keanu sat beside him, not trying to add anything, just listening. His presence alone said enough. He looked over at Morgan, not with pride, but with gratitude, as if he too had received something in this journey. The host leaned in again, asking what everyone else must have been wondering. "Morgan, after a lifetime of being seen as a voice of authority, of wisdom, even playing God in film, what does it feel like now to be the one seeking?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "It feels like freedom," he said. "It feels like letting go of having to know everything and finally being okay with needing something greater than myself." The camera zoomed slightly on his face. "I've played powerful men, presidents, judges, even the voice of the Almighty. But none of those roles ever touched the part of me that needed healing. That was always kept off screen. Until recently." Then he turned again to Keanu. "You showed me a different kind of strength. One that doesn't need a stage. One that listens, that forgives, that believes people can change. That kind of strength. That's what made me believe again." Keanu looked at him softly. "You did the brave part. You asked." The host gave them space, choosing to stay silent and let the moment breathe. After a few seconds, Morgan continued. "I want to say this to anyone who's ever felt like it was too late, too dark, too far gone. If a man like me, skeptical, stubborn, stuck in my own ways, can begin again at this age, then there's hope for anybody." The audience erupted, but Morgan held up a hand gently, not to silence them, but to center the moment. "I'm not here to convert anybody. I'm not here to be a preacher. I'm just here to say, I've found something worth holding on to, something real, something eternal. And it started when I heard someone speak about Jesus, not with pressure, but with love." The host finally spoke again, this time his voice more emotional than polished. "We've had thousands of interviews on this show, but I don't think I've ever seen anything like what just happened between the two of you." He turned to Keanu. "Keanu, what do you hope people take from this?" Keanu looked into the camera, his tone gentle. "I hope they know that faith isn't a weapon. It's not a performance. It's not about being perfect. It's about presence. It's about grace. And it's always available, no matter where you are." Morgan placed his Bible on the table between them. "Let the world talk," he said. "Let the headlines spin, but the truth is, I'm different now." And as the segment closed, the camera caught something quiet. Keanu reached over, not for drama, not for attention, and simply took Morgan's hand. Two men. Two journeys. One savior. And millions watching. Silent. Changed. Awakened. The broadcast left a deep mark, not just on the audience at home, but on the entire entertainment industry. Overnight, The segment featuring Morgan Freeman's quiet confession of faith topped trending lists on every platform, not for controversy or shock value, but because it felt genuine, the kind of moment no scriptwriter could have orchestrated. And soon, Hollywood took notice. Calls poured into Freeman's team from producers, journalists, publicists, and fellow actors. Some were skeptical, some were curious, some, surprisingly, were deeply moved. People who hadn't reached out in years were suddenly asking for meetings, not about roles, but about what had changed him. One well-known director texted Morgan late one night, "I saw the interview. My daughter hasn't spoken to me in a year, but after watching you, she called me." Another, a veteran actor who had battled addiction, wrote simply, "If this Jesus thing is real, I want in." It wasn't the reaction the studios expected, but it was the one Morgan hoped for. He didn't care about creating headlines, he cared about creating hope. Within days, rumors began to swirl around Hollywood. Whispers of a possible faith-based project involving both Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman started circulating through agencies and trade papers. A few outlets even reported that the two were collaborating on a new film inspired by their real-life story. Neither man confirmed it, neither denied it. But behind the scenes, something was indeed in motion. A script had landed in Keanu's hands. A quiet, powerful story about grace, grief, and second chances. Not flashy, not award bait, just honest. And while Keanu hadn't committed to it publicly, he'd sent it to Morgan with a note that read, "This feels close to what we've lived. Let me know." Morgan read it in one sitting. Then he called Keanu and said 3 words, "I'm all in." Suddenly, agents who had once avoided faith-driven scripts began quietly requesting meetings. Casting directors whispered about the Reeves-Freeman effect. Studio executives, ever driven by audience interest, floated new ideas about stories with soul. Something had shifted. Not a revolution, but a ripple. A seed spreading. Yet through it all, Keanu remained grounded. He turned down 2 major interviews and politely declined an invitation to speak at an industry panel about spiritual awakening in Hollywood. He wasn't interested in turning the moment into a movement for attention. He told his manager plainly, "If I ever speak, it won't be for strategy. It'll be for love." He wasn't afraid of telling the truth. He simply refused to commercialize it. Morgan, however, began to open up. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when it came, he used it differently. During a magazine profile shoot, the interviewer asked him about his recent shift. Morgan smiled and said, "I used to think peace was something you earned after enough success, but now I know it's something given once you surrender." The article titled the piece, "Morgan Freeman Finds Faith and Finds Himself." He spoke of redemption in interviews, of forgiveness, of finally letting go of bitterness he didn't know he was carrying. And again, he pointed back to the moment that changed everything. "Keanu introduced me to Jesus," he told one reporter, "and it changed everything." The quote went viral within hours, not because of the drama, but because of the simplicity. "Keanu introduced me to Jesus, and it changed everything." Those 8 words were shared by pastors, skeptics, influencers, and film critics alike. Some reposted it with awe. Others questioned his sincerity. But even the doubters couldn't deny that something had shifted in the way Freeman spoke, the way he carried himself. It wasn't the Morgan Freeman they'd known. It was someone lighter, warmer, present. At a press event for a different project, a journalist pushed him further. "Are you saying you've converted to Christianity?" Morgan didn't blink. "I'm saying I've surrendered my need to explain everything. I've accepted that love is bigger than logic. And Jesus? He's not an idea to me anymore. He's real." Across the room, cameras clicked. The moment would make headlines. But what mattered more was what happened afterward. Several crew members quietly approached Morgan when the press cleared out. One said her son had just started asking questions about faith, and she didn't know what to say. Another, a sound technician, simply said, "I haven't prayed since my brother died, but I did last night." And quietly, behind the velvet ropes of Hollywood, something began to grow. Not a trend, a quiet hunger. Writers began developing stories with soul. Independent producers sent Keanu scripts not filled with spectacle but meaning. Small, beautiful stories about redemption, aging, forgiveness, faith. Keanu didn't rush. He read every one carefully. He didn't want to attach his name to something that used Jesus as a hook. He wanted honesty, stillness, truth. If a script felt pure, he would respond with curiosity, but if it felt manufactured, he gently stepped back. Morgan followed the same compass. They had started something they never meant to, but they had no interest in exploiting it. At a charity gala weeks later, the two men stood side by side, one dressed in black, the other in gray, arms crossed, quietly watching the auctioneer. A young actor approached them, nervous but determined. "Mr. Freeman? Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to say, I saw your interviews. I'm not sure what I believe, but for the first time in years, I feel like it's okay to ask." Morgan placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's not just okay," he said. "It's the beginning." Keanu added softly, "Real faith starts with real questions." The young man nodded. Tears welled up in his eyes. He didn't say another word. He just smiled and walked away. And that was how the transformation spread. Not in church pews or tabloids, but in quiet conversations, in unexpected places, in hearts that had been waiting years for something real. Morgan kept doing interviews, but each time, when asked about his career, he brought it back to one thing. "The most important role I've ever played," he said on one occasion, "is the one I'm playing now. A man being rebuilt from the inside." When someone joked that Keanu should be credited as his spiritual director, Morgan laughed gently. "No, he just loved me when I didn't ask him to, and that's what Christ does." And through it all, Keanu never tried to lead the movement. He just kept planting seeds, quietly, faithfully, and Hollywood, for once, paused to listen. It was a Sunday morning unlike any other in that small church tucked into the edge of the Santa Monica Hills. The sun had just broken over the horizon, casting golden light across the hillside. Inside the chapel, the pews were nearly empty. A handful of close friends sat quietly. There were no paparazzi, no booming announcements, no grand production. Just warmth, reverence, and a stillness that seemed to hold its own breath. Morgan Freeman stood near the front in a simple white shirt. The lines on his face, carved by decades of experience, carried a peace they hadn't known before. He looked out over the quiet sanctuary, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't performing. He wasn't reciting lines. He was arriving. Next to him stood Keanu Reeves. He wore a simple black jacket, the same one he'd worn to countless dinners and quiet nights reading scripture with Morgan. His eyes were glassy, but he didn't wipe them. He let the emotion settle in. For weeks they had walked this path together, but today, Morgan was taking a step no one could take for him. The pastor, a soft-spoken man named Daniel who had served the same congregation for over 30 years, stepped forward. He had met with Morgan privately several times, not to instruct him, but to listen. Morgan had come with questions at first, but now he came with something different. Surrender. The baptismal font wasn't fancy. It was a stone tub filled that morning with warm water, placed beneath a wooden cross and surrounded by candles flickering gently. As Morgan stepped in, his movements were deliberate, steady. His feet touched the bottom, and he turned to face the congregation. Keanu gave him a small nod. Pastor Daniel looked into Morgan's eyes and spoke with gentle firmness. "Morgan Freeman," he said, "you come today not as a public figure, but as a man. A man who has found peace, hope, and love in Christ." Morgan nodded. The pastor continued, "Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" Morgan took a breath. "Yes, I have." His voice did not shake. "And do you commit to follow him, not just in word, but in your life, your heart, and your spirit?" Morgan's answer came without hesitation. "With everything I have." The pastor raised a hand above the water. "Then it is my honor to baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." He gently guided Morgan backward into the water. Buried with Christ. Morgan disappeared for only a moment beneath the surface. But in that moment, it felt as though something was left behind. Then he rose. He raised to walk in new life. As the water streamed down his face and his shirt clung to his chest, Morgan smiled. A full, open smile that didn't reach for attention. It came from somewhere deeper. Keanu stepped forward as Morgan exited the font. He wrapped a towel gently around his friend's shoulders. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. The few in attendance stood, quietly clapping, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. A sacred moment had unfolded, one none of them would ever forget. Morgan turned, still dripping, and looked out the window at the sunlight pouring through the stained glass. He whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you." After the service, there was no press release, no red carpet moment, just coffee, soft hugs, and warm laughter in the small fellowship hall behind the chapel. Morgan sat with Keanu at a quiet table, sipping from a ceramic mug someone handed him. His shirt was still damp and his socks were off, drying on the back of a chair, but none of it mattered. He felt freer than he had in decades. Keanu leaned over and said quietly, "How do you feel?" Morgan didn't answer immediately. He stared down at his hands, then looked up, eyes misty. Clean, not perfect, but new. Keanu smiled. That's the only kind of new that matters. A few hours later, a private video was shared with Morgan for his review. A discreet camera, approved ahead of time and placed at the back of the chapel, had captured the baptism. It was meant to be a keepsake for Morgan, something personal. But after watching it, Morgan sat quietly with his thoughts, then called his team. "I want to share it," he said, "but not through the studios, not the talk shows, just let the people see it." So a short 90-second clip was uploaded to his official page with a simple caption. "On this day I chose new life." It was quiet, unpolished, intimate. The video showed Morgan stepping into the water, answering with "Yes, I have," and rising again to the words, "Raised to walk in new life." No background music, no edits, just the truth. Within hours, it was everywhere. The comment section filled faster than anyone anticipated. If Morgan Freeman can find faith at this stage of life, maybe I can too. I've been scared to believe. This gave me courage. I never thought I'd cry watching a baptism video, but here I am. Within 3 days, the clip had over 30 million views across platforms. Churches started playing it before sermons, youth groups discussed it, recovery centers aired it in meeting rooms. People who had never set foot in church were now watching a quiet, dignified man choose faith, not in a stadium, but in a sunlit chapel. Reporters called, of course. They wanted exclusives, behind-the-scenes commentary. But Morgan didn't bite. He released one statement, and one only. "I didn't do this for publicity. I did it for peace. If it gives someone else hope, then I'm grateful." Keanu said even less. When asked during a movie press junket if he had seen the video, he smiled and replied, "I was there. I didn't need to re-watch it." But privately, he watched it twice. And he wept both times. The ripples continued. A young producer reached out anonymously to Morgan's team, explaining he'd grown up in church but had left years ago. After seeing the video, he visited a chapel for the first time in 12 years. "It felt like coming home," he wrote. Emails poured into Morgan's team from strangers, a single mother in Detroit, a teenager in Brazil, a retired soldier in Wyoming. They all echoed the same thing. If he can believe, maybe I can too. And perhaps that was the real miracle. Not the baptism alone, but the honesty of it, the simplicity, the way it made faith feel accessible again. Not as a debate, not as a brand, but as a quiet, personal choice. The day Morgan Freeman went under the water was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of something much deeper, something eternal. And Keanu Reeves, standing silently nearby, knew that sometimes the most powerful moments don't need to be shouted. They just need to be lived. Months passed quietly after Morgan Freeman's baptism, but the ripple effects continued to grow. What began as a deeply personal transformation between two men had become something bigger than either of them expected. But it didn't evolve through headlines or interviews. It grew through people, everyday men and women who saw something honest and couldn't forget it. One afternoon, during a long walk through Griffith Park, Morgan turned to Keanu with an idea. What if we didn't just tell our story? What if we helped others tell theirs? Keanu looked at him curiously. There are people out there, Morgan continued, who've found faith or are searching for it, or maybe just standing on the edge of something they don't understand. What if we gave them a platform, not to preach, not to prove, but just to share? Keanu stopped walking. He thought for a moment. Only if it's real, unscripted. Morgan smiled. Only the raw stuff. They called the project Come As You Are. It started with no studio backing, no big network, just a small team, a rented studio space, and a simple set. 2 chairs, soft lighting, and room for a story. Each episode featured one person, no celebrities, no big names, just voices, broken, humbled, honest. A former gang member who found peace behind bars. A widow who forgave the drunk driver that took her husband. A single father who rediscovered God through his daughter's cancer diagnosis. Each story was different, but they all shared one thread: grace. Morgan opened the first episode. He looked directly into the camera. My name's Morgan Freeman. I used to think God was a role. Then I found out he was a person, and he wasn't far away. He was waiting. The rest of the episode was silence and testimony, no music, no edits. Just truth. Keanu sat behind the camera during the taping. He never appeared in the series by his own request, but his fingerprints were on every frame. He helped choose the guests. He sat with them before the interviews. He made sure they felt safe, that they knew this wasn't about production, it was about presence. The series was uploaded to a modest YouTube channel with no expectations, but within 2 weeks the views soared, and the comments began to change. These weren't just reactions, they were confessions. This story saved me from suicide. I never thought I'd believe again. Then I heard her speak. I'm a 64-year-old man. I haven't cried in 30 years, but tonight I did. Churches across the country began to reach out. One rural pastor in Kentucky said his entire men's ministry had doubled in a month. Another in Colorado said his small congregation saw more men over 60 walk through the doors in 3 weeks than in the previous year combined. They weren't coming for programs. They were coming because they saw someone like them, older, weathered, tired, find faith. And it gave them hope that it wasn't too late. The stories kept pouring in, not just from the United States, but from all corners of the world. A missionary in the Philippines wrote that the series was being translated into Tagalog and watched by locals who had never heard of Morgan Freeman or Keanu Reeves, but were captivated by the raw honesty of the voices they heard. A pastor in Norway said a group of skeptical young men who usually mocked religion had watched 2 episodes and asked to meet with him afterward. Baby said it was the first time they believed someone actually meant it. What surprised everyone, except Morgan and Keanu, was how quickly people responded to quiet faith. No dramatics, no flashing lights, no hype. Just brokenness and healing, doubt and grace. One evening, while reviewing an upcoming episode with the team, Morgan turned to Keanu and asked, "Did you ever think it would go this far?" Keanu looked down for a moment, then replied softly, "I didn't think about how far. I just thought about how true." The clip of Morgan's baptism, still floating online, had now crossed over 100 million views. But it was no longer a sensation. It had become a kind of touchstone, something people came back to during hard weeks or lonely nights, or times when they needed to remember that even the most respected voices could still be searching, still be growing. Keanu remained as consistent as ever. He never stepped forward to take credit, and he never needed to. His life, the quiet way he lived, the way he refused to turn personal moments into platforms, had become the message. He showed up where no cameras were, at shelters, recovery centers, a few hospitals. He brought books instead of speeches, coffee instead of spotlights. He sat in silence more than he spoke. But when people asked why he cared, he always gave the same answer: because someone did that for me, and Jesus never stops. Morgan continued speaking publicly, not as a pastor, not as a theologian, but as a man reborn. His interviews were different now. He didn't care if the film critics approved or if his answers seemed spiritual enough. He spoke plainly. "I used to think being wise meant knowing everything. Now, I think it means knowing who to follow." And when asked, again and again, what changed you, his answer never changed. "Keanu introduced me to Jesus, and Jesus introduced me to myself." By the end of the year, Time magazine ran a feature titled "The Year Hollywood Sat Down to Listen." The article highlighted how the entertainment world had unexpectedly been shaken, not by scandal, not by shock, but by something ancient. Faith, but not the kind that shouts. The kind that waits, whispers, welcomes. Underneath the article, the most liked reader comment simply said, "If Morgan Freeman can find peace through Christ, maybe there's still hope for me too." And that's what it became in the end. Not a trend, not a brand, not a show, just a testimony. One man baptized in a quiet church. One friend who stood beside him. One Savior who had never left either of them. And millions still listening. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering candle on a small oak desk. Outside the window, the night was still. No cars, no wind, just quiet. Keanu sat alone, a journal open before him. The leather-bound cover was worn, edges softened from years of use. He held a pen in his hand, unmoving for a long while. Then, slowly, he began to write. "We're not here to be famous. We're here to love." He paused, reread it, and underlined the word love twice. It was something he had come to believe not just with his mind, but with his whole life. Over the past year, everything had changed. Not his career, not his fame. Those things had remained. But something deeper had shifted. His sense of purpose had become clearer, quieter, and more rooted in something eternal. He glanced over at the small wooden cross sitting on the windowsill. A gift from a nun he had met while visiting a cancer ward in San Diego. She had pressed it into his hand and said, "Stay close to the light." He kept it near ever since. That night, with the world asleep around him, Keanu closed his eyes and prayed. Not a grand prayer, just a whisper. "Thank you, Lord," he said quietly. "Thank you for using even broken people like me." He thought of Morgan, of how far they had come, of the baptism, of the series, of the millions of people who had been touched not by perfection, but by vulnerability. The whole journey had been built not on eloquence, but honesty. He opened his journal again and wrote another line. "The world doesn't need more noise, it needs more stillness, more truth, more grace." As he set the pen down, he breathed in the silence. Then his voice returned, this time not in writing, but in words meant for anyone listening. Maybe you're watching this tonight, and you're not sure what you believe. Maybe you've been hurt by people who claim to speak for God, or maybe you've just gone numb. I get it. His voice stayed steady but gentle. "Been through the dark. I've felt the weight of grief, of failure, of questions without answers. But I want to tell you something simple, something I wish someone had told me sooner." He paused, just enough for the silence to breathe. You don't have to fix yourself to talk to God. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. He's not waiting for you to get everything right. He's just waiting for you to turn. He let those words settle. Are you weary? Are you doubting? Then talk to him. You don't need a speech, you just need a moment. He's already listening. The candle beside him flickered, casting shadows against the wall, dancing like grace in motion. Keanu placed a hand over his heart, feeling the slow rhythm of a man no longer rushing to be heard, but learning to be still. And to anyone who was listening, his next words were more than a closing. They were an invitation. If this story moved you, Keanu said softly, comment below. I'm coming home. He paused to let the invitation land. Maybe you've been wandering. Maybe faith once made sense but got buried under pain, loss, or disappointment. Maybe you feel too far gone, too cynical, too broken, but you're not. You're never too far. His voice remained calm, almost like a whisper across a campfire. I've met men in prison who found Jesus in their darkest hour. I've met grieving parents who still believe, even with tears in their eyes. And I've seen someone like Morgan Freeman, who spent his whole life asking the big questions, finally whisper a prayer and say, I'm ready. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. You don't have to have it all figured out. God's not asking for perfect answers. He's just asking for your heart. He gave a small smile, the kind that carries weight. And when you give it, you'll find that he was never far. He was always near. Even in the silence, even in the shadows. He opened the journal again, flipping back through previous pages. Lines written late at night, after hard days, between film sets, before hospital visits. Words scratched into paper, not for art, but for healing. He read one entry aloud. Race is the sound of chains falling, not because I earned it, but because I'm loved anyway. He closed the journal and set it aside. This world is loud. It will try to define you by your mistakes, your past, your pain, but God defines you by His mercy, His love, His Son. Another pause, just long enough. If you're coming home today, say it. Write it in the comments. I'm coming home. Not for me, for you. He let the words settle into stillness. And before we end, I want to ask something personal. His voice softened again. Who helped you discover faith in your life? He looked into the camera like he was looking into a friend's eyes. Maybe it was a parent, maybe a stranger, maybe someone who sat beside you and didn't try to fix you, just stayed. His next words came slower, with meaning in each breath. I'd love to hear about them, so would others. Leave a comment and tell us who helped you believe. You never know who's reading, and you never know how your story might help someone else. The candle on his desk burned low, almost finished. Keanu leaned back in his chair, eyes peaceful. We're not done sharing stories. In fact, we're just beginning. So if you want to keep hearing these stories of hope, of healing, of unexpected grace, he nodded once. Don't forget to subscribe, not because it's a number, but because it's a light someone else might need. Outside the window, the moon hung high over Los Angeles, a city of noise. But in this room, there was quiet. There was peace. And for those listening, maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something holy. A new chapter, a return, a homecoming,